for questions. Feel free to speak up along the way if you don't want to lose your question. So yeah, I've spent my career basically taking care of patients with neurological issues, including epilepsy patients, and then developing new medications. And so we're going to spend most of our time talking about clinical trials, and then on the back end of the conversation, I'll tell you a little bit about what we have going on at Xenon Pharmaceuticals. Next slide. So we'll get into the details of what exactly is a clinical trial, hopefully illuminate anything that's ambiguous to you on that front. You may have heard people talk about the phases of clinical trials. I'll explain to you what that means, some basics. If you were to be interested in participating in a clinical trial, I'll talk to you about what that's like. And then we'll talk about Xenon clinical trials and then leave time for questions. Okay, next slide. Okay, what is a clinical trial? So clinical trials are research studies in which volunteers help find answers to specific questions about the safety or effectiveness of new treatments. And what I can tell you, first of all, I myself have participated in a clinical trial, so I know what it's like firsthand. And what I can tell you from conducting a lot of clinical trials throughout the years, there's a great deal of oversight. So whoever is running the study, Xenon Pharmaceuticals is one group that runs clinical trials. There's a lot of oversight within the company to make sure that things are being done appropriately, quality, safety, and several other functions. And then there's also oversight by review boards, ethical review boards. We'll talk about what that means. And then also by the Food and Drug Administration of the US, which is charged with protecting the safety of all the people in the US from the standpoint of medications and food. Next slide. Okay, when people are talking about the phases of a given clinical trial, I want to explain what that means. Typically, you'll hear the people refer to clinical trials being in phase 1, 2, or 3. Before I get to the explanation of that, I just want to tell you that there's years of work that goes in before that. There's a blue arrow here that says drug discovery. But this is essentially chemists and biologists trying to figure out what could a new medication do that the other medications haven't done previously, and trying to create new chemicals that may serve that need. As you go from drug discovery into phase 0, phase 0 could mean a couple things. It could either mean that it's a non-interventional study, so you have humans who are participating, but there's no intervention, there's no treatment. You're just sort of keeping an eye on what's happening to them over time to kind of understand whatever disorder they have. Could also be what we call microdosing, where you're using an extremely low dose of an intervention that has very low chances of having any kind of safety issue. Then you enter into phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 1 is it's usually a relatively small study, and these are normal, healthy volunteers. So these typically tend to be younger people who have no medical issues, and you have a medication that you're interested in trying to help patients, and you start off with a single dose of a very low amount of the interventional medication. You try that in a handful, say 6 or 8 patients, and learn from that in terms of the safety, in terms of how the drug is in the blood. And if that goes well, then you go to the next higher dose and keep going on with like one dose in. And then if that's safe, you then proceed into multiple dosing where normal healthy volunteers would be dosed, say, for 1 week or 2 weeks. If that goes well, you can proceed into phase 2 clinical trials, which is typically involving patients. So it could be an epilepsy patient, or it could be a patient with whatever neurological or non-neurological issue that you're interested in treating. And the focus is largely on safety, but usually you get some readout on whether the medication is effective to some degree. That goes well, you can go into phase 3. So phase 3 are typically the larger studies that are still keeping an eye on the safety to make sure that the drug is safe. But now you start confirming that the drug actually works in these larger trials. And that's the phase that needs to be completed before a drug can be approved. So once you get through phase 3, you submit an enormous amount of information to the FDA. using a new drug application or NDA. And if they think the drug is safe and effective, the drug becomes approved, and then a physician can write a prescription for that medication. Up to that point, the only way you can get a hold of the investigational drug is through a clinical trial. And then phase 4 studies are studies that are conducted to understand the medication a little bit better after approval. Next slide. And next slide, talk about some basics. So what's a clinical trial protocol? Essentially, it's typically about a 100-page document, and it goes through what the purpose of the study is, what it takes to be eligible or ineligible for that study. It is largely designed to protect patient safety and participants in that study. And it also goes into details about what will be done during the course of that study, both in terms of the tests, any procedures, and then, of course, the treatment itself. The duration of the trial will be defined, and then any other relevant information. Next slide. So an institutional review board. So I've also, in addition to participating in a clinical trial, I've actually served on an IRB, an institutional review board. So these are required by FDA regulations. And this is a group separate from the clinical site who take a look at the protocol and are completely looking through the lens of making sure that everything is safe for the participants. And I can tell you, having served on one of these, that it's usually made up a combination of physicians and other healthcare providers, could be nurses, could be pharmacists, could be a scientist. We try to have IRBs also include people who do not have a healthcare or scientific background, so they can see it through the lens of somebody who would not have that background, which is the case for a lot of people participating in these studies. Anyway, I hope you're getting the theme here, that these are highly regulated, not just by what's done at the company level, but also what's done at the ethics board, otherwise known as the IRB and FDA. Next slide. Let's talk about who's involved with the clinical trial. So there's the sponsor. Xenon Pharmaceuticals is one example of a sponsor. It could be a university, or it could be a government-funded agency like NIH that's interested in trying to figure out whether medication is helpful for patients. Participant is somebody who volunteers. The principal investigator is the person who's responsible for the study at a given site. So if you're going to New York University, Beth Israel Deaconess, the Mayo Clinic, there'll be one person, typically a physician, who's responsible for that study in its entirety at that particular site. And then he or she works with a study coordinator, which could be a nurse or not, and that person is responsible for being the main point of contact for the volunteer, and does a lot of the heavy lifting at the site in terms of making sure that everything that needs to be done gets done, and all the staff are coordinated properly, and all the questions are answered by the volunteer. Okay, let's talk about informed consent. I mean, there is a history of studies being conducted without proper informed consent, and so there's a lot of regulations around this. Before you can participate in a clinical trial, you have to understand everything that's involved. You have to understand that participation is completely voluntary. You need to understand what the purpose of the research is, what are the risks, what are the potential benefits, what are the alternatives, and who is your contact if you decide to participate. So the informed consent, it can be, anywhere from 6 or 10 pages on up to 20 pages with a lot of information about the study. And the idea is that you go through this with whatever time that you need, ask as many questions as you need. And then if you were interested in the study, after being properly informed of all that information, you could sign and then potentially be a participant in the study. Okay, so let's say you get past that point, what will be involved in a clinical trial. I will tell you that they are fairly time consuming, and so I think it's important to go into it understanding that it will take some time. Let's talk about some terms that are relevant. So there's placebo. I think many of you probably know what that is. That's an inactive substance that looks exactly like the study treatment. And the placebo response is really quite strong. The natural healing power of the mind and the body are really quite powerful. And so to really know that you're having an impact, it's very important to be able to have the placebo to compare to active treatment. Randomization is the process by which you either randomly receive placebo or you randomly receive the active medication. And the purpose of that is to avoid any bias that I mentioned before that can kind of impact the benefits or the side effects potentially. And then blinded means that you're unaware of whether you're receiving placebo or active drug. So the volunteer himself or herself are blinded. So that's one blind. And then the other blind is that the site employees, the investigator and the coordinator are also blind. They don't know what's being received. So that's why it's called double blind. Both the participant and the study site are unaware of what's happening. And then just before you go from that slide, and then just to make you aware, a lot of studies have open label extension studies after the double blind period. So after a given period of time, certain sponsors and certain studies will allow open label extension. So if you hear that, what that means is that you're absolutely guaranteed to get the active drug from that point forward. Okay, step one. So let's say you were interested in participating in a clinical trial, reach out to your physician. So if you were interested in an epilepsy trial, you would talk to your neurologist, your epileptologist, ask about whether there are any trials to participate, are there any new treatments, and of course that they're obviously a great source of information for other trials. Assuming there continues to be interest, the pre-screening process is really just gathering more information about the clinical trial to see if potentially there's interest, from you as a participant, and whether the site expert believes that there may be an appropriate trial for you. And once you get through the pre-screening process, you enter the screening process on the next slide, and also the consenting. And so this is so once you've signed the informed consent, we talked about that. That gives you all the information about what the purpose of the trial is and exactly, very detailed, what will happen. Once you sign that, you can kind of enter a screening period. And during that screening period, various tests are done to make sure that you're indeed eligible for randomization. So randomization is where you actually get the interventional medication or you receive placebo for a given period of time. And I think I sort of already covered this. You get allocated to one group or the other. Some studies can have two treatment groups. So you have one group for active and one for placebo. Sometimes there are multiple treatment groups. It really kind of depends on the study itself. Okay, so this is sort of a transition where we start talking a bit about the clinical trials that we have going on at Xenon Pharmaceuticals. Just before we go to the next slide, just, on a high level, well, first of all, just let me know if you have any questions. And the mission at Xenon is that we're interested in trying to improve the lives of patients living with neurological conditions. And specifically, most of our effort right now is on epilepsy, but we're also interested in medications that can potentially treat depression. And patients who have epilepsy at various points in their life may or may not struggle with some issues with depression or anxiety. And so there is overlap in terms of those two interests at Xenon Pharmaceuticals. So let's go to the next slide. We have 3 phase 3 studies ongoing, and we're studying a medication called XEN 1101. This is a medication that affects the potassium channels in the brain and basically calms down hyperexcitable neurons, like you would have potentially in people living with epilepsy. So XTOL is the name of a phase 2b study that was completed with over 300 patients. That study suggested that XEN 1101 worked for focal onset seizures. That study's been published in the medical literature. And now we're in phase 3 with X-TOLE2 and X-TOLE3 studies, which are identical phase 3 studies for people who have focal onset seizures. So focal onset seizures are seizures that emanate from a small area of the brain and may or may not spread out beyond that point. So those are 2 studies. The third phase 3 study that we have is called EXACT, and that's for people who are living with primary generalized tonic-clonic seizures. All of those studies are assessing Xenon 1101 in hopes of confirming what we saw in phase 2, which suggested that the drug was well tolerated and potentially useful for patients with focal onset seizures. It's once daily. Xenon 1101 is dosed once daily. There's no need for titration. It's dosed with food. And as I mentioned, it's been previously tested in a study of over 300 patients, and that's why we're going into phase 3. And this is the last step before the drug gets assessed by FDA as whether it's worthy of being approved and available in pharmacies. So if you're interested in participating, here are some of the criteria for the X-TOLE2 and X-TOLE3. Again, those are the 2 studies for focal onset seizures. You have to be 18 years or older. You have to have focal onset seizures for a duration of 2 years or more. It's required that you be on at least 1 and no more than 3 anti-seizure medications, and that you had already tried 2 anti-seizure medications but are still experiencing seizures. The other phase 3 study is called EXACT. As I mentioned, this is for people living with primary generalized tonic-clonic seizures. The age cutoff is lower in this study, so you have to be 12 years or older. Obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but if you're under 18 years of age, you must have a legal guardian answer a questionnaire, and then eventually it would have to consent for you to if you were interested in participating in the study. As with the other study, you have to have primary generalized tonic-clonic seizures. You have to be on between 1 and 3 anti-seizure medications and have tried at least 2 other anti-seizure medications and still be experiencing seizures. So that could be 2 in the past, or it could be 1 in the past and you're on 1 right now. So as a participant, what would you receive? You would be reimbursed for travel relevant to the study. You could receive a stipend for the study visits because, as I mentioned, they do take time, several hours. And then study medication is obviously provided at no cost. And then all of the procedures within the protocol are paid for by the sponsor. And so there's no cost and there's some reimbursement for your time and travel. Let's kind of talk a little bit more about the logistics if you were interested. There's a short questionnaire we'd ask you to fill out. There's more information in upcoming slides. It's completely voluntary, and just because you express an interest in a clinical trial does not mean that you have to commit. Obviously, I've kind of outlined that there are several steps leading up to signing an informed consent form before you'd actually participate. So it's information gathering. After that, if you're interested, you fill out the questionnaire, there'll be a phone call from a group that we're working with called Patient Wing. A representative from Patient Wing will call you, discuss the study, talk a little bit more about the details of what it would take to participate and answer any questions that you have. And at the end of that information gathering session, if you were still to be interested or someone you know would still be interested, then you would be put in contact with a member of the research site. So either the coordinator at a site or potentially investigator or sub-investigator. The next step is, as I kind of outlined in a previous slide, the pre-screening, where you get more information on what would be involved in the study, and then you make sure that you feel comfortable with the informed consent form from beginning to end before you would participate. After signing the informed consent, the study, like I said, it is a pretty big commitment. So the study lasts for 7 months, broken down into 3 different treatment periods. You have a screening of up to 9.5 weeks. The treatment period where you're either receiving placebo or active drug is 12 weeks. And after that, there's a 3-year open label a 3-year open label extension where you're guaranteed to receive the interventional medication. And during the course of the study, there is a seizure diary that has to be filled out so that we can quantitate the seizures and make sure that the medication is actually helping you. Okay, just a little bit more. I've mentioned Patient Wing. This is the group that we're partnering with to share information about the 3 phase 3 epilepsy studies. Patient Wing's mission is to bring better treatments to people faster. And so they help sponsors, namely Xenon, find patients who are interested in participating in the study, and then sort of help out with the enrollment process and make you comfortable with each one of the steps. So if you're interested in Patient Wing, that website, just before you go to that slide, the previous slide, www.patientwing.com. And then on the next slide, I'll hang on this slide for any questions that you have. But if you want to get started, you can reach out to via email, studies@patientwing.com. There's a phone number up there, the 213 number for calling or texting if you want information. If you prefer to go to the study website, you can go to epilepsy-study.com. And then if you're a QR code type of person, you can go ahead and scan that QR code. So that hopefully that's helpful. That's an overview of clinical trials. Like I mentioned, I've participated in clinical trials. I've participated in ethic boards. I've run, many trials throughout the year, taking care of a lot of patients with epilepsy and other neurological conditions. So hopefully some of that was helpful. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.